So what do I think of these Epstein files? Well, the first takeaway isn't actually the most important, but it's worth making. The first takeaway is Attorney General Pam Bondi is an idiot for not releasing these files a year ago. Now, I don't mean that as an ad hominem. You know, I have no personal vendetta against her. I do think that she is a significant liability to the Trump administration for reasons that we have detailed and cataloged at length, and we will again. When I say she's an idiot, it's an idiotic choice to have cost the president this much political capital only to ultimately release the files. If you make a calculated decision that you're never going to release the files and you know it's going to cost you XYZ amount of political capital and you decide that it's worth it to you, I obviously don't agree with you, but hypothetically, that's what politicians do all the time. They make decisions and they analyze how much political capital it's going to cost them. But if you make a decision and you know that decision's going to cost you a certain amount of political capital, and then you don't even stick by the decision, you allow that political capital to be wasted only to ultimately do what people were demanding that you do in the first place, that is just the epitome of stupidity when it comes to politics, let alone the justice of the whole thing or the transparency that we were promised. This didn't have to happen. President Trump could, at this very moment, enjoy the level of enthusiasm that we all felt for his administration this time last year, if not for Pam Bondi. The second takeaway, and this is the most important takeaway from the entire Epstein files, is that President Trump, Donald Trump, even before he was the president, has been totally exonerated once again. In 3 million documents, not a whiff of wrongdoing. Let me repeat that. 3 million documents is a lot of pages. Not a single credible accusation or association with Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. None. In fact, per Epstein himself, who you remember actually hated Trump, Epstein wrote to so-called journalist Michael Wolff that Trump, quote, never got a massage. Totally exonerated. Totally. Which, of course, tells us something that we already knew, but it's worth remembering. Democrats are liars. Liars. And the mainstream media are worse than you think. You think that you can't hate the mainstream media enough. The allegation in the Epstein files that Trump raped a 13-year-old, that allegation was contained in a portion of the files known as the tip line. Now, the tip line, we covered this briefly yesterday. The tip line was exactly what it sounds like. It was an open phone line submission form that the FBI enacted during their investigative process. And anybody here in the United States, around the world, anybody could submit anything they wanted to this tip line, which of course led to a lot of crazy people submitting a lot of crazy unsubstantiated crap to this tip line. This particular allegation against Trump is exactly what Democrats have been hoping to find, and they have run with this. They've acted like this is a credible accusation, and yet in these documents, it is very clearly noted that the FBI found that allegation to be non-credible. Again, the tip line was open to any nutcase anywhere in the world who called in. So most accusations that were phoned into this tip line were like secondhand gossip and easily disproved. And I'll give you a specific example here. Part of the allegations against Trump in this tip line that was found to be non-credible involved Trump's golf course out in Los Angeles. And the allegation was supposedly that the wrongdoing took place sometime in the range of 1995 and 1996. And yet, Trump's LA golf course didn't open until 2006, a discrepancy of 10 years. Now, this doesn't take a rocket scientist. This doesn't take a detective like Sherlock Holmes to find out the truth. It takes maybe like a cursory Google search. The media knows this. And yet, they report and they reported and are continuing to report on this allegation as if it's true and substantiated and something that the FBI found because the mainstream media hates you. the most important takeaways from the Epstein Files. One of the most important takeaways is something that we already knew, which is Bill Gates is an absolute creep. Like, just a creep. And I said this years ago. I remember I had a video that went viral multiple years ago, and that was the title of it, Bill Gates is a creep. A creep who allegedly, he denies this, but you choose who you believe, a creep who allegedly contracted STDs from Russian hookers and fed his wife antibiotics on the sly after he realized he had contracted these STDs from Russian hookers. Now, how do we know about this? Jeffrey Epstein wrote an email to Jeffrey Epstein. He sent an email to himself memorializing this alleged conversation between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein, because the allegation is that Bill Gates asked Jeffrey Epstein for the antibiotics after he had contracted these STDs from Russian hookers, and he wanted to sneak antibiotics to his wife on the sly. So I suppose she did not contract the STD from him. Now, first of all, my initial reaction to this is, if Bill Gates was willing to slip his wife antibiotics on the sly, what is he willing to slip us on the sly? But remember, we're supposed to trust his vaccines, you sheep. The second thing that is instructive about this email from Jeffrey Epstein is, why would Jeffrey Epstein send such an email to himself? The only reason that someone would take the time and write out an email and send it to himself in this way is because he wanted to use this information at some point in the future. So when we were told last July by Pam Bondi that there's no evidence that Jeffrey Epstein ever engaged in any kind of blackmail operations, this email seems to indicate that is not true. Why else would Jeffrey Epstein email himself such information? Now, perhaps most interesting of all, Jeffrey Epstein was revealed in these documents to have emailed with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Now, we know that Jeffrey Epstein had a very long-standing and very close relationship with Ehud Barak. That's not new information. That's existing information that we were aware of. But the contents of this particular email is also very informative. Epstein emailed Barak asking him to deny association with the Mossad. Now, Barak's response is quite humorous, if you want to categorize it that way. None of this is funny, but it's quite humorous because Ehud Barak was like, well, deny your association or deny mine? Well. I think we all know at this point that Epstein certainly brokered deals for Israeli intel. We know that. Among other intel agencies around the world, it probably wasn't just the Israeli intelligence apparatus. And he did so off the books. When governments wanted a deal done and they didn't want to look like they had their hands in that deal, they used Epstein as a broker or a liaison, sort of a fixer. You combine that email between Epstein and Ehud Barak with the photograph of Jeffrey Epstein. This was also from the documents. The photo of Epstein in a room filled with stacks of bankers' boxes. And if you look very closely at the stacks of bankers' boxes, they all have one label on them. The label says the same thing. That label reads CIA. So it's not a far stretch to ask, what is Jeffrey Epstein doing in a CIA office with a bunch of bankers' boxes labeled CIA? You combine that with a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request from Epstein, asking the CIA, it was a FOIA request to the CIA, asking Epstein to disclose what information the CIA had on him. This is pretty interesting information. You know, Simon in the live chat says, where is that picture of Epstein? We can bring that picture up on the screen. We can bring the picture of Epstein in the office with the bankers' boxes labeled CIA. You combine this, the email between Epstein and Ehud Barak about the Mossad, the photo of Epstein in a room filled with bankers' boxes labeled CIA, the FOIA request that Epstein filed asking the CIA to disclose whatever information they had about him to him. You combine that with an email in 2018 Steve Bannon, the Steve Bannon that you're familiar with, yes, who communicated widely with Jeffrey Epstein, conducted an interview. I believe he released 2 hours of it this week. Steve Bannon sent Jeffrey Epstein an email in 2018 about Acosta. Now, the Acosta that we're talking about is, of course, Alex Acosta, the former U.S. attorney. He's the one that cut the non-prosecution agreement. We colloquially refer to it as the sweetheart deal that Epstein got instead of facing prosecution. There's the picture, by the way, on the screen. That's Jeffrey Epstein standing with someone whose face is blacked out in a room with a bunch of filing cabinets. In the back of that room, you'll see those red circles on those banker's boxes. If you zoom up on that photo, on those red circles, each of those red circles is circling CIA. CIA. So is that in the bowels of the CIA? Is that in Langley? There's no way to tell. But it seems that it might be, because why would those boxes labeled CIA be anywhere else? Anywhere else. So Alex Acosta, the former U.S. attorney who cut the non-prosecution agreement with Jeffrey Epstein, Steve Bannon sent Epstein an email about Acosta, and Epstein's response was uncharacteristically cryptic, uncharacteristically short. He said, and this is a direct quote from Jeffrey Epstein, "Do you know Bill Barr, CIA?" Well, yes, we do. Know Bill Barr? Yes, we do. And yes, we are familiar with Bill Barr's father, who was the first intel connection that Jeffrey Epstein had, seemingly. Bill Barr's father had hired Jeffrey Epstein to be a math teacher, though he worked for the CIA. Bill Barr's father did, and thus opened the door to connection between Epstein and the CIA. Why would Jeffrey Epstein respond to Steve Bannon and say, "Do you know Bill Barr, CIA?" Now, here's the interesting part. Interestingly, in the past year, and this is no thanks to the Department of Justice, it has gone from a question: was Jeffrey Epstein associated with intel agencies? And if so, which agencies? It's gone from a question to now it's established with ample evidence that Epstein was associated with intel agencies. Doing what? Brokering off-the-books deals that governments did not want to appear directly involved in, though they certainly were. So you could describe Epstein as a liaison. He served as a liaison, and he profited hugely. And he did this, by the way, not just for governments. He did this for individuals in positions of power, too. He's working as a fixer, teaching politicians essentially how to blackmail their connections that they have gained in politics. How much has changed this past year? Even the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, now acknowledges that Jeffrey Epstein was what he was, a broker, a fixer. You remember when Netanyahu posted this article about it. And the end of this article, by the way, concludes by saying this: even with the wealth of material that's been released, this is the author of the article speaking, Epstein's exact relationship to Israel remains unclear, not to mention an answer to the specific question of whether or not he belonged to Israeli intelligence. While the latest disclosures show Epstein had a keen interest in Israel and its politics, they also show he held a similar interest in many countries and regions and had relationships with a variety of power players across the Middle East and around the world. But what they should mean, as a minimum, is an end to the widespread taboo of even asking questions about billionaire sex offenders' links to the Israeli state. Epstein brokered security deals for Israel, had a close friendship with one of its former prime ministers and military officials, and apparently even secretly involved himself in the country's elections. If it were any other country, it would not be remotely scandalous to wonder out loud what it all could mean. End quote. That article was posted on X by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. How much can change in a year? We were falsely accused of being anti-Semitic for noticing the evidence that ties Jeffrey Epstein to Israeli intelligence and other intel agencies around the world. And now it's established fact. There's ample evidence of this, which again brings us full circle to the reason that we've all been demanding justice on Epstein for so long. He committed heinous sex crimes against underage girls, and he was let off easy for those crimes. And we now know why. due to his obvious associations with these rich and powerful people, these global intel agencies. But the question is who? Who let him off? We were aware of the existence, by the way, before this 3 million batch of documents were released. We were aware that an indictment from 2007 existed, that the feds back in 2007 had actually drafted an indictment against Epstein. They were intending to charge him. In this indictment, we'd never seen it, though. We'd never seen the document for ourselves. We just knew that it existed. But the draft of this indictment has now been released. And in it, Epstein is accused of sex trafficking, enticing over a dozen minors, these girls between the ages of 14 and 17, over a span of years, 2001 to 2007. And it shows exactly how Epstein groomed these girls. They would contact the girls via the phone. They would lure them to his properties. They would pay them for massages that escalated to sexual acts and then coerce them to bring their friends along. And then threaten anybody who wanted to get off that abuse. And it's jarring, I think. We knew this existed, but it's jarring to see this indictment written out because he was never charged. He never was indicted. Why not? Epstein wasn't indicted because suddenly, prior to the filing of this indictment, he was cut a non-prosecution deal. If he would plead guilty at the state level in Florida to some of these crimes, then he wouldn't be prosecuted at the federal level. And he served time in a halfway house? That he was still allowed to leave for work. But this indictment was written. The Department of Justice wanted to charge him, and they had enough evidence. They wrote out the indictment. It was there. The evidence was solid. Which means that some person or persons in the Department of Justice or in the intel apparatus or in the White House at the time said no. Told Alex Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, to back off. Don't charge Jeffrey Epstein. Don't file this indictment. Don't do it. Who let him off? Now, I'm sad to say that despite the 3 million new documents, that question is still left unanswered. We don't know who let Jeffrey Epstein off, but we know that he was let off, and we know why. And a lot can change in a year. A year ago, we only had the answer to one of those questions, and now we have the answer to two. Who knows what the next year will bring? Maybe we will get the answer to that third question. What we know for certain, and this is the biggest takeaway from these Epstein files, is that Democrats' lies about Donald Trump have been exposed again. Democrats are liars. They lie through their teeth, maliciously, viciously, intentionally. But President Trump, once again, was totally and completely exonerated. Not a whiff of wrongdoing in over 3 million pages. Nothing. Our movement is gaining ground. People around us are waking up. The mainstream media leftist narrative is cracking. At BlazeTV, we've built a home for some of the strongest, smartest voices in conservative media. When you subscribe to BlazeTV, you're not just watching content, you're supporting a movement. You're backing creators who think for themselves. It's everything that the networks won't show you, delivered on your terms on any device, anytime. And it starts at just $8 a month. BlazeTV.com/Liz, promo code Liz.